Hello, dear students, and this is lecture number 7 of the Cultural Studies course. The lecture will be divided into 2 parts with the same title. The title is Stephen Greenblatt and New Historicism. So let us start the first part of the lecture by talking a bit about the title. As you see, we have the name of a famous contemporary intellectual, Stephen Greenblatt, an American author and Harvard University professor of the humanities who has also visited several of the prestigious universities all over the world and gave seminars and lectures in these universities. He is considered a cultural critic who writes books and articles and gives television talks and so on about the contemporary affairs, whether political, economic, literary affairs. So he is a cultural critic in the widest sense of the word. And he has written several books. We will give you some examples of his more famous titles later in this lecture. But for now, it's enough to know that he is well published and he has a number of award-winning titles that we will talk about later. Now, as for New Historicism, this is one of the important schools of criticism right now, ever since 1982, when Greenblatt first coined this term, and he has been considered the most influential theorist and practitioner of New Historicism. Greenblatt defines New Historicism as an interdisciplinary and multiplicitous way of knowing. Now, the term interdisciplinary, when we describe a certain theory or approach or methodology as being interdisciplinary, we are referring to the fact that it crosses the boundaries between disciplines. For example, if you are a student of literature, but you are adopting a new historicist approach while analyzing a novel or a play or a poem, you will have to deal with other disciplines in addition to the literature discipline. You will have to deal with history, of course, as the name shows, New Historicism. So I'm sure that history will be very important in your work if you are adopting this school. And you will have to deal also with other disciplines, maybe political science or economics or even religion, and with other arts, because this approach of New Historicism deals with art in general, not just literature. It deals mainly with literature, but also with the visual arts like painting, and again discusses these visual arts in an interdisciplinary manner, taking into account other disciplines in addition to the painting or the novel and so on. That is why the definition has another term, which is multiplicitous way of knowing. Like if you are using this New Historicism to get to know information about a work of literature, then you will be adopting multiple or multiplicitous way of knowing, because it will involve an investigation or an examination of more than one discourse. So, Stephen Greenblatt is the founder of New Historicism or Cultural Poetics. The two terms refer to the same school. And as we said, he first coined this term in 1982 in his editorial introduction to a book entitled The Power of Forms in the English Renaissance. In this editorial introduction, Greenblatt cites the bitter reaction of Queen Elizabeth I to the revival of Shakespeare's play Richard II on the eve of the Essex Rebellion. You know that the Essex Rebellion is an act of insurgency or a sort of rebellion, a rising against the throne of England, and it happened during the time of Queen Elizabeth, but it was put down. This rebellion did not achieve its purpose, and because this Essex Rebellion happened a short time after the performance of one of Shakespeare's more famous historical plays, which is the play about Richard II. And this play actually deals with conspiracies and acts of rebellion and political instability or unrest and chaos. Because of this, many people, including Queen Elizabeth I herself, made a connection between the play on the one hand and the Essex Rebellion on the other, as if this play was an instigator or a provocative agent, or at least it was a sort of inflammatory address that resulted, in addition, of course, to other factors. The play was not the only factor, but the play helped or was part of the reasons or the factors that encouraged the Essex Rebellion. Now, when Greenblatt mentioned this anecdote or this story or this historical event, and he made this connection between a Shakespearean play on the one hand and a political rising on the other hand, he decided to use the term New Historicism in order to show or illustrate the mutual permeability of the literary and the historical. The word mutual, of course, refers to the double direction, like literature influences history and history influences literature. So it is not just simply a matter of historical background. It's not like we are studying the play and we study the historical background of the times in which the play was written. It is more complex than that, because it is a mutual relation, like a permeability. This side, the literary, it crosses to the real life events and affects the events that become history later. And history itself affects the writing of the play or of works of literature in general. And because of this anecdote, Greenblatt started using this term, and it became, as we said, one of the more important schools that are used nowadays by students of literature like yourselves when they are analyzing works of literature. It is interesting to know that Greenblatt focuses on the times of the Renaissance, Renaissance literature, or the Elizabethan times, and considers these times to be very important because they are transitional. Sometimes we call them the early modern times also, not just Renaissance, because they are like a transitional zone between the dark medieval ages before them and the rise of modernity and the Enlightenment after them. So, focusing on the Renaissance helps the work to like illustrate certain emergent factors, like new forms of literature appear and older forms maybe disappear, or not fully disappear, but they become like integrated in the newer forms and take a new appearance. And these forms are always related to forms of power. That's why the title includes the word power, and cultural critics in general are very much interested in the concept of power and its relation to all other aspects of culture. Another point related to new historicists is that we can contrast them with other schools of criticism, especially the formalist schools, like Russian formalism or new criticism. Such formalist schools, unlike new historicism, they insist on studying works of literature in isolation from the culture in which these works were produced. These formalist schools focus on the form or the structure of a work of literature, and they also analyze the content of the poem or play or novel they are studying, and they regard this work of literature as a detached object that possesses an organic unity, or we can call it a wholeness, independent of any surrounding circumstances. I am sure that now you can guess that such a position on the side of the formalist schools of literary criticism would put them in direct contrast or opposition with the new historicist school. New historicism always see a work of literature as embedded in the culture in which it was produced. In other words, they think of culture, which of course we all know that it includes such various aspects of the lifestyles of people, the way they eat, the way they dress, the way they are happy and have their weddings, or they are sad and have their funerals, the songs they like to listen to, the entertainment they prefer, the beliefs and the value systems, the religion of the people, as well as the literature they produce and the political system or the system of governance that rules them, and the economic system that they have in their societies. All these things together, they come under the umbrella term of culture. And new historicists consider that literature cannot be separated from this culture in which it was produced. Culture, to them, is a semiotic system, a network of signs. And whenever we mention the word network, so there must be cross connections, links between the different signs or the different aspects of any culture, and we can never separate one of these signs from the other signs with which it is interacting. So, when someone like Greenblatt studies a Shakespearean play or studies a contemporary novel or a poem, they see it in light of its conditions of production, and these conditions, let us try to enumerate some of these conditions. They would include, number one, the author himself or herself, and the position of this author in history. And by the position, we are referring to different aspects that characterize the author, aspects such as race, gender, class, ideology, political affiliation, so many things. Now, the second condition of production, which is of importance to a new historicist analysis, would be the extra-textual reality, the reality outside the text, the extra-textual reality or the real world in which the author lives, such as the political or economic condition of the country. Again, number three, the third condition of production that needs to be analyzed if you are a new historicist would be the other discourses, the discourses that are contemporaneous with this work of art or this work of literature, whether these discourses are literary discourses. For example, if you are writing a novel, your novel can be seen in light of the other novels that are written at the same time, or the novels even that came before it, and so on. And not only the literary discourse. If you are writing a novel, I will compare, if I am a new historicist, I will compare your novel to non-literary discourses. Maybe somebody wrote a political pamphlet, or someone wrote an article about economics, or it doesn't have to be even writing. It can be something in the media, a movie or a song or a television talk show or whatever, or a newspaper article, or the social media, of course, nowadays. All these things would be seen as part of the network, which is the whole culture, and as affecting each other. And you would need to take a look, if you are a new historicist, to take a look at all these various aspects when you are studying the work of art. In other words, we can see, like the second point in your slide here, it tells us that new historicists are resistant to disciplinary hegemony, finding in interdisciplinarity an important way of generating knowledge. Now, this is exactly what we have been saying when we said that they study the conditions of production from different aspects, studying the author, studying the extra-textual reality, studying other discourses, whether or other texts, whether literary discourse or non-literary. And this means that they resist or reject or refuse to say that literature is superior or has a certain form of hegemony, what we call disciplinary hegemony, that criticism, literary criticism or literature is superior to other disciplines such as history or politics or religion or so on. New historicists would reject such a stance. They would say that all the disciplines are equal. There is no disciplinary hegemony. Literature does not have to be seen as above the other disciplines. That is why we study literature in the context of other disciplines. And they say that in order to generate knowledge in an as accurate and comprehensive a way as needed, then we must follow an interdisciplinary approach. Now, another point which they have to study, in addition to the three that we mentioned, would be the point number 4, about how the work itself influences the present. For example, if someone writes a play and the play causes social unrest or rising, or certain laws to be passed by the government, or certain decisions to be taken. So the word itself is very important, and a novel can sometimes lead to changes in the legal system or so on. It doesn't have to be just one novel. Of course, maybe it will come as a culmination of so many attempts that have been taking place, but we need to study not just how the extra textual reality affects the work, but also how the work affects this reality. And again, all the 4 points that we mentioned about studying the author and studying the other discourses, literary and non-literary, and studying the extra textual reality of the real world itself, and also how the work of art affects them, these 4 points, we need to add a 5th point to them, which is about the past. Now, if I am studying the work of literature and its conditions of production, these conditions of production, it is true that they are embedded in the present, but also they will be related or influenced by the past, conditions of the past, whether the discursive conditions or the extra discursive ones. Of course, the discursive would be related to discourse that was written in the past, literary and non-literary, and the non-discursive or extra discursive would be the historical events of the past and how they are affecting literature. So again, a new historicist always studies culture as a semiotic system, a network of science, and sees literature as part of this network, and rejects any disciplinary hegemony for literature, and sees that interdisciplinarity is the only way in order to generate knowledge about a work of art. Thus, when new historicists examine a work of art, they see it as a meeting point of all the cultural influences that helped shape both the past and present, and that helped shape the work of art itself. They also examine the different ways in which this work of art changes our perception of events, whether past events or contemporary events. By contemporary, of course, I refer to the events happening at the same time of writing the work of art. Which means that, according to new historicists, students of literature can no longer consider history as a unified myth. What do we mean by a unified myth? We mean someone telling you that the Elizabethan age was a time of peace and harmony, full stop. That's the whole story about it. If someone tells you something like that, or a certain time was a time of wars and instability and violence, full stop, it is never a single story. It is never like a unified myth. If you are a new historicist, you will be suspicious. You will have your doubts about a unified myth. You will say that unified myths are always false, because in any age, whether it is the Elizabethan age or the contemporary times or the Greek times, the Roman civilization, whatever, or if we are talking about any culture like medieval African culture or like pre-Columbian Native American culture, you can never have a single comprehensive story that tells you everything you need to know, or in other words, quote unquote, the truth about a certain culture or a certain age. It is never like this. There are always multiple versions of the same story. For example, let me give you an example from our present times. You know that in a few weeks' time, there will be the presidential elections in the USA, in the United States of America. You have President Donald Trump, and he is going to be one of the candidates, and you have another candidate, Biden, and they are going to have this event, this major event of the elections, and one of them will win the elections. Okay, if you ask someone, a political analyst or an expert on economics, or a television presenter, one of the CNN journalists, for example, or other channels like Fox News or so on, if you ask them about America, the United States, during the times of President Trump, he or she can give you a certain version depending on the ideological position of the speaker. If the speaker is pro-Trump, the version will be like a positive one, or if the speaker is anti-Trump, the version will be, the version of the story he gives you will be, or she gives you will be like a negative one. And most probably the truth, which is very difficult to decide, the truth lies midway or some way between the multiple versions, if you like. So the same applies to history. Like the point that you have on your third slide, the point which begins with history, according to the new historicists, how do they see history? They think of history as what happened in the past, a set of events, a number of events that happened in the past. This is history. And they think of history also as the account of those events, or the story that reached us about these events. But the story is never a single story. It is never one story. Even when it is the story given by the majority, like for example, suppose we are reading about historians who have written about Egyptian history, for example, during the 17th or 18th century. Maybe we will find that 80% of these historians say one thing and 20% say another. Usually there will be multiple versions, and you will have to conduct a thorough investigation in order to try to reach the truth as much as possible. It is never the whole truth, but you will say that according to your investigation, you are going to adopt this version of the events because you have reached a number of accounts that seem to be offering evidence or factual information and so on. So the point is, if you are a new historicist, you regard history as two parts: the events that happened in the real world and the story or stories that have been written about these events and that reached us. And you are going like to to act as a detective or an investigator in order to see which of these stories seem to be the more truthful, and this is what will help you when you are writing your work of literature. Now, this thing about how new historicists do not believe that there is one story that can explain everything about the past, this point especially makes new historicists very near to another contemporary school, which is postmodernism. Of course, we are not going to talk about postmodernism, it's out of the scope of our course now, but it is just that we need to refer to this point that postmodernists, I am sure that you are familiar with the term and you hear it a lot and you read it a lot. Postmodernists, they have many characteristics, and we need to speak about so many things to explain the postmodernisms with an S, because it can have more than one definition. But postmodernism, one of its major features is that it is suspicious or doubtful or skeptical about what they call the grand historical narratives, the narratives that try to tell us everything that happened and tell us that this is the true story, do not believe any other version. The postmodernists do not take that. They say no, there are many stories and each story has its truthful points and its false points, and we are going to select and see which of these are more truthful, if you like, according to our position. So new historicists, they say the same thing. They say that we cannot accept a single story, we cannot accept that just all Native Americans, for example, were uncivilized or barbarians or had no culture whatsoever, in the sense, of course, of high culture and so on. We cannot accept that. If you are a new historicist, you are going like to pick and choose. You will discover that Native Americans themselves, they are many peoples, they are a plurality of nations, and they differ among each other in their degree or level of sophistication and civilization and so on. So actually this multiplicity or this rejection of a single story as the correct one is like a guiding feature of new historicists in their relation to history when they are analyzing works of literature or works of art in general. And again, the final point in your slide is about how this new historicists, as we said, are suspicious of unified monolithic, and the word monolithic is just like when you have one account and you say this is the only account which is true. Monolithic depictions, like you are monopolizing the truth, like you say my story is truthful, they do not accept that. Depictions of cultures or historical periods, they view such unified myths about a culture or an age as accounts created to serve a particular interest in the present, such as the longing for a golden past that Nietzsche calls antiquarian history. They say that sometimes people who are living a problematic present, they long for an imaginary golden past. They tell themselves that once upon a time humanity was living in a golden age and there were no problems and people were happy and peaceful and harmonious. Now, new historicists do not believe any such accounts about a golden past or about what Nietzsche, the philosopher, calls the antiquarian history. They say this is simply a false myth, and we need to accept the multiplicity of historical stories and to examine them all equally and to try to do our best to see the best of them, and to see how these stories are reflected in the works of literature, and how the works of literature that are written in the present will affect our perception of the past and the present, and will also maybe lead to changes in the world, the real world in which they were produced. Thanks a lot. We have reached the end of part 1 of lecture 7, and we will continue next time the second part of the same topic.